Picture a crime scene. No blood, no body, no yellow tape, but trillions of dollars are missing, and billions of people are living with the consequences right now. Some countries are drowning in wealth. Others can't keep their lights on. And the question that nobody wants to answer honestly is, how did this happen? Because here's the thing. It wasn't luck. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't hard work. If you were born in Norway today versus Niger, same brain, same ambition, your life outcomes would be completely different. Not slightly different, completely. So today, we're going to do something most finance channels won't do. We're going to follow the money all the way back, thousands of years back, and we're going to figure out who robbed the world, how they did it, and why the effects are still playing out in 2026. Buckle up. This is going to change how you see everything. Every detective will tell you, to solve a crime, start with opportunity. Who had the opportunity to get ahead first? And the uncomfortable answer is, it wasn't talent, it wasn't culture, it was dirt. Literally, the quality of the soil, the animals roaming nearby, the shape of the rivers. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans started figuring out farming. But farming didn't just happen everywhere equally. Some regions hit a geographic jackpot that others simply didn't. The Fertile Crescent, the strip of land running through modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, had wild wheat and barley growing everywhere. These weren't just any plants. They were nutritional powerhouses, high calorie, easy to store, easy to grow more of. Meanwhile, other regions had plants you could barely do anything with, and it gets deeper. The Fertile Crescent and Europe also had animals, cows, horses, sheep, pigs, that could be domesticated, that could pull a plow, carry a load, feed a family. Sub-Saharan Africa had zebras. You ever try to ride a zebra? It doesn't work. They're aggressive and nearly impossible to tame. Same with the large animals of the Americas. Bison, which resist domestication, and most megafauna that went extinct before humans could even use them. This wasn't anyone's fault, but it mattered enormously, because societies that could farm efficiently could do something revolutionary. They could produce more food than they needed. That surplus, that's where civilization began. When you don't have to spend every single day chasing your next meal, your world opens up. Think about what a food surplus actually unlocks. You now have people in your community who don't need to farm. So what do? Some become soldiers, some become priests, some become engineers, some become merchants, some become scribes. You get specialization, division of labor, and with that, you get complexity. Cities start forming, governments emerge, writing systems develop, not for poetry at first, but to track grain inventories and tax records. Money is invented, essentially, as an accounting tool. And here's the kicker. All of this creates a feedback loop. More food leads to more people. More people leads to more specialization. More specialization leads to more innovation. More innovation leads to better tools. Better tools lead to even more food. Economists have a term for this: path dependence. Once you're on a certain track, momentum builds. Getting ahead early makes it easier to keep getting ahead. Think of it like compound interest, but for civilizations. The regions that got this loop going first, Mesopotamia, Egypt, parts of China, Europe, were building infrastructure, empires, and trade networks, while other regions were still in the early stages of agricultural development, not because those other people were less intelligent, because the dice of geography rolled differently. This is the part that most people skip when they talk about global inequality. They want to jump straight to colonialism or modern policy, but the roots go much deeper, and if you don't understand the roots, you'll never understand the tree. Now here's a plot twist that sounds almost unbelievable until you look at the data. One of the most powerful forces in reshaping global power wasn't a weapon, it wasn't an army, it was a microbe. Remember those domesticated animals? The cows, pigs, horses, and chickens that gave Europe and Asia such an agricultural advantage? Living in close contact with animals for thousands of years exposed those populations to wave after wave of disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Millions died over centuries. It was brutal. But, and this is the dark irony, the survivors built up immune resistance. Generation after generation, natural selection was quietly doing something devastating, creating populations that could carry these diseases without always dying from them. Now fast forward to 1492. Columbus lands in the Americas. The people there had been isolated for thousands of years. No large domesticated animals. No exposure to these diseases. No immunity whatsoever. What followed was arguably the single greatest demographic collapse in human history. Some estimates say that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of European contact, not primarily from swords and muskets, but from diseases they had never encountered. 90%. Let that number breathe for a second. Entire civilizations, the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, hundreds of smaller nations, were hollowed out before European armies even needed to fully fight them. Disease didn't just kill people, it erased institutions. It destroyed the knowledge holders, the leaders, the farmers, the engineers. It left power vacuums that were then filled by European colonizers. This wasn't intentional biological warfare, at least not initially, but it had the effect of one, and it made what came next drastically easier. By the 1400s, Europe had been compounding advantages for millennia. Strong centralized states, advanced metallurgy, gunpowder weapons, sophisticated naval technology, maps, compasses, a culture of competitive nation-states that pushed exploration and conquest. And one more thing, motivation. European states were fighting each other constantly. Resources were always tight. The incentive to find new trade routes, new territories, new wealth, it was enormous. So they sailed, and what they found was not empty land waiting to be claimed. It was a world of civilizations, resources, and peoples that European powers systematically dismantled and reorganized for their own economic benefit. Latin America became a massive extraction machine. Spain and Portugal stripped out silver and gold on a scale the world had never seen. The Potosi silver mine in Bolivia alone produced enough silver to literally fund the Spanish Empire for 2 centuries. Indigenous and enslaved African people did the labor. The wealth went to Europe. Africa lost somewhere between 10 and 15 million people to the transatlantic slave trade. These weren't just human beings. They were farmers, craftspeople, community leaders. Entire regional economies were destabilized as African leaders were manipulated into raiding their neighbors for captives to sell. Centuries of potential development were redirected into chaos. India, at the time of British arrival, was one of the wealthiest regions on Earth, responsible for roughly a quarter of global GDP. The British systematically dismantled India's famous textile industry because it was outcompeting British manufacturers. They extracted resources, redirected trade, imposed taxes paid in British currency, and drained an estimated $45 trillion in today's money over the period of colonial rule. This wasn't trade, it wasn't development, it was a structured transfer of wealth from the colonized world to Europe. And the infrastructure that got built in colonized regions, railroads in India, ports in Africa, they weren't built for local development. They were built to move resources out faster. Now, with all this extracted wealth flowing into Europe, something extraordinary happens. Britain in the late 1700s becomes the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. And again, this wasn't random. The conditions were specific. Britain had coal deposits right next to population centers, cheap, accessible energy. It had rivers and canals for cheap transportation. It had strong property rights, meaning inventors could actually profit from their inventions. It had high wages, which sounds counterintuitive, but high wages pushed factory owners to invest in labor-saving machinery rather than just hiring more workers. And it had an empire, a captive global market to sell manufactured goods into, and a source of cheap raw materials. Steam power changes everything. For the first time in human history, economic output was no longer limited by the number of human muscles or the speed of horses. Machines could work faster, longer, and cheaper than any human. Productivity exploded. Per capita income rose in a way it never had before in recorded history. Western nations pulled ahead of the rest of the world at a speed that was simply unprecedented. Economic historians call this the Great Divergence, the moment when Western incomes permanently separated from global averages. But here's the question nobody asks loudly enough. Why didn't the rest of the world industrialize too? Because the conditions weren't just different. In many cases, they were actively prevented. Colonies were structurally locked out of industrial development. Britain didn't want competition from India's textile industry, so it crushed it. It didn't want Latin American manufacturing competing with British goods, so it kept those economies in extraction mode. The wealth that might have funded local industrial investment had already been extracted. The educated classes that might have driven innovation had been deliberately kept small or excluded from power. The institutions needed for large-scale industrial finance, stock markets, central banks, property rights existed in Europe after centuries of development. Most colonies started from zero. The game was rigged, and the rigging was deliberate. After World War II, colonial empires began to collapse. Between the 1940s and 1970s, dozens of countries gained independence across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. This sounds like the story should end there. Freedom achieved, now develop. But independence didn't come with a reset button. The borders that newly independent nations inherited were drawn by European powers at conferences where African and Asian leaders were not even in the room. Borders sliced through ethnic groups. They jammed rival communities together. They separated natural resources from the populations that depended on them. The institutions left behind were designed for extraction, not governance. Many colonizers deliberately avoided building strong local civil services, universities, or legal systems because an educated, organized local population was harder to control. Literacy rates in many newly independent nations were devastatingly low. Industrial infrastructure was minimal. Capital markets barely existed. Meanwhile, the Western nations that had just spent centuries extracting wealth from these regions had fully developed legal systems, universities producing hundreds of thousands of graduates, deep industrial ecosystems, and functioning financial markets. The race wasn't starting from the same line. It was more like Western nations had been running for 2 hours, and everyone else was just getting to the starting block. Economists have a term for this: institutional persistence. The gap between institutions doesn't close automatically or quickly. It compounds, just like wealth does. Now, and this is critical, the story isn't purely deterministic. Some countries did break the pattern. Japan never went through Western-style colonization, and after the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, the Japanese government made a radical decision: modernize aggressively, or get swallowed by Western imperial powers. They sent students abroad. They imported technology. They built institutions. By 1905, Japan had defeated Russia, a European power, in a war that shocked the world. South Korea in 1960 had a GDP per capita lower than some African nations. Today, it's a high-income economy with global technology giants. Taiwan, Singapore, and of course, China. What did these countries have in common? Strong state direction of the economy, long-term investment in education, export-led growth strategies, the willingness to play the global trade game while protecting domestic industries in their early stages. They didn't just wait for the market to fix things, they engineered their development. And that tells us something important about why wealth gaps persist. It's not that development is impossible for poorer countries, it's that the conditions required are specific, and historically those conditions were disrupted by the very powers that now sit at the top of the global wealth table. The geopolitical instability you see playing out right now, tensions between the global South and Western powers, rising China, African nations renegotiating resource deals, Latin American political turbulence. It all makes sense when you understand this history. The rest of the world is catching up, not because Western countries got weaker, but because compounding finally started working for others too. More education, more infrastructure, more industrial capacity, more capital formation. China is now the world's largest economy by purchasing power. India is on track to become the third largest. African economies are growing. Southeast Asia is becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. And this shift, the redistribution of economic gravity after 5 centuries of Western dominance, is causing friction. Because wealth and power are deeply connected, and nobody gives up power easily. Understanding this history doesn't mean assigning blame. It means understanding cause and effect. Because if you don't know how wealth was built and concentrated, you cannot understand how it can be rebuilt and redistributed. And in a world where you're trying to build your own financial life, understanding macro forces like this is part of the game. So, back to the crime scene. Who robbed the world? The honest answer is a combination of geography, biology, and deliberate human choices, compounding over thousands of years. Geography gave some civilizations a head start. Biology weaponized disease. And human beings, powerful ones, made choices that locked in advantages and locked others out. The world we live in today is not an accident. It is the accumulated result of thousands of years of decisions, disasters, and compounding effects. And knowing that, really knowing it, changes how you see economic news, global politics, and even your own financial decisions. If this video made you think differently, share it with someone who needs to see it. Drop a comment telling me what surprised you most. I'm Robert Moore, and this is Money with Robert Moore. See you next time.